Hello, everyone, and welcome to this forum on sustainability organized by Cell Press. In the next hour or so, we will explore the collective impact of city and corporate climate pledges, the socioeconomic equity of decarbonization policies, urban planning's influence on household sustainability, and the balance between climate mitigation and adaptation in cities. My name is Abby. I'm an editor at One Earth, Cell Press's flagship sustainability journal. Behind the scenes today are my fellow editors, Camilla and Mauricio from iScience, which is a Cell Press journal particularly excited about interdisciplinary science, and Richard Thompson from Cell Report Sustainability, our gold open access sustainability journal. Just quickly in terms of format, following this brief introduction, I will invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Angel Xu, to share her thoughts. Then I'll invite our panelists, James Evans, Joan Fitzgerald, and Ayub Sharifi to talk about their research areas. Following the talks, we will have a panel discussion and invite questions from our audience. Sustainability research is challenging and exciting because of how interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary it can be. Cities are a great example. Urban decarbonization requires integrating environmental sciences, urban planning, economics, social sciences, engineering, and public policy to develop effective and equitable solutions. And this is why we began the Cell Press forums on sustainability. We really hope to bring together scholars with complementary expertise and spark conversations on the complex challenges of navigating a more sustainable path forward. So we're very excited about today's discussion. Just briefly, I'd like to highlight Cell Press's portfolio of sustainability-related journals. Besides One Earth, Cell Report Sustainability and iScience, several other journals frequently publish sustainability-relevant content. We've also linked Cell Press's Sustainability Hub, which highlights events and content from across the portfolio in the Resources tab, which I believe is on the right for audience members. Before I hand the mic over to Angel to open the forum, I'd like to mention some logistical details for our audience. On the right of your screen is our Q&A chat. We encourage audience members to ask questions for the speakers or upvote questions from others. Our behind the scenes team will be adding links to references that come up in conversation to the top of the Q&A chat as well. All right. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Angel Xu at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Angel is the founder and director of the Data-Driven Enviro Lab, an interdisciplinary and international research collective focused on applying data-driven approaches to derive actionable insights to environmental challenges, such as climate change and urbanization. She has also contributed to influential reports by the National Academy of Sciences, the IPCC, and UNEP, and is recognized for her public outreach and contributions to global policy discussions. Over to you, Angel.
Thank you so much, Abby. And yes, DDL is a mouthful, so I normally just try to abbreviate it. So let me, hopefully this works. And okay, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on urban decarbonization, which is a topic that's at the top of my mind these days, not least because I have the privilege to be a lead author of the upcoming IPCC AR7 special report on cities and climate change. And this is a really special report because it's the only special report in this IPCC assessment cycle. And it's the first one particularly focused on cities. And additionally, in every single chapter, along with a scientific lead author chairing the chapter, there's also a practitioner that has also been invited. So the whole point is to develop actionable insights that can actually be implemented in cities. And so to prepare for this conversation, I went back through the 5th assessment report and the 6th assessment report to just tease out some of the knowledge gaps. Why is it so difficult for cities to decarbonize? And what is lacking in the scientific literature and our knowledge about what works for cities? And so these are some of the conclusions that I came to. And the gaps are really clear. First of all, cities lack consistent, comparable city scale emissions data. currently only about 10% of the cities that have pledged some kind of climate action are actually regularly developing inventories. So it's really difficult to make comparable insights in terms of what works where and what are the best practices and what actually leads to emissions reductions. Second, we have a thin evaluation of how urban form and land use actually shape mitigation in practice. It's really difficult for established cities to modify those urban forms to unlock those mitigation solutions. And then third, even though there's a lot of talk and a lot of buzz in the policy setting about nature-based solutions, it's really unclear how cities are actually to implement them and what the mitigation payoffs are. It's very poorly quantified. And then the fourth gap has really come up a lot since I've been working on the special report on cities. We know very little about informality, how off-grid energy, housing, and waste systems actually move the emissions needle. And then, of course, models and tools. This is what I work a lot on. They rarely capture real urban systems or future urbanization uncertainty. It's difficult to know how cities are going to develop in the future and how their emissions might shift. And then last, our governance playbook for turning data and models into decisions across levels of government is underdeveloped. So in every chapter of the IPCC, we're talking about multi-level governance and its importance for actually developing and mobilizing climate solutions. But how that actually works in practice and how to make it effective is still an open question. And we lack a lot of evidence to suggest what models actually work. And the timing of this report and analysis could not be more urgent. My team's latest research shows that cities account for a large and growing share of global emissions. So these are the latest numbers. This paper is currently in peer review. Hopefully it'll come through on the other side. But what we have found is that roughly 73% of territorial emissions are coming from urban areas. And when we look at consumption emissions, so these are imported embodied emissions or emissions that are not occurring directly within a city boundary, urban areas are responsible for a whopping 81%. These estimates, they use a new urban boundary method that better captures peri-urban and transitioning areas, yielding more accurate territorial and consumption-based footprints. And so you can see the result. On these maps, the color scale shows the difference in contribution shares. So the red areas are where the urban contribution exceeds rural, and the green shows where the rural exceeds the urban. And because you can see that urban areas are responsible for the lion's share of global emissions, they're absolutely central to any type of credible decarbonization pathway. And so this data sends a clear message. Cities have to manage both sides of the ledger. They have to cut the emissions that they generate from buildings, the power sector, and transport, while also tackling a much trickier set of the equation, and that's consumption-based emissions. So through procurement, standards, and trying to also curtail demand. And they have to also coordinate with surrounding rural contributions where emissions also could dominate. And when we take a closer look at which sectors are driving emissions, the story is one of persistent structural concentration in just a few sectors. So from 1970 to 2020, we can see that the dark orange areas correspond to energy supply and industrial activity, and they still contribute the majority and the largest share of urban emissions. Although if you look at the light green area, the share of on-road transport has increased with motorization in urban areas around the world. And then I think what's also interesting about this figure, it's really hard to see, but the dark green area are waste-related emissions coming from urban areas. So it's pretty small for most cities, but they still remain a salient contributor in many rapidly urbanizing contexts. And then what's interesting is the yellow portion, these are building-related emissions. They've decreased somewhat over this time period, but and that's likely because their emissions contributions are mediated by the carbon intensity of electricity within a city. So this breakdown helps us to identify where are emissions coming from for cities, and then that could potentially unlock levers to then reduce them. Well, the positive news is that cities acknowledge their current and growing contributions to global emissions, and while recognizing that they are some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, becoming at greater risk of floods, heat waves, and extreme weather events. So they're not just sitting back and waiting for national governments to take the lead. In our latest Climactor database, which we just updated and released this past month, so head to our website and you can download the latest data set, which we've actually spatialized more than 15,000 cities that have pledged some kind of voluntary climate action, or they're participating in a transnational climate initiative, or they've made their own climate action plan. So in that database, we have 15,000 cities, but then 10,000 of those we have actually measured that they have developed some kind of climate action plan. whether it's focused on mitigation, adaptation, energy, or some integration of those approaches. And so the good news is that thousands of cities, so we have close to 10,000, have some type of mitigation plan where they're setting their own targets to reduce emissions. So in the next couple of slides, I'll focus particularly on quantifiable emissions reduction targets, since these are typically the most comparable type of climate action where we can find sufficient data to evaluate their impact. And so what have we found? Well, when we hone in on the G20, which is responsible for more than 85% of global emissions, we found that more than 3,000 cities and regional governments, comprising 27% of the world's population, have pledged some kind of quantifiable emission reduction target, along with data that we can use to then measure their progress. And it's clear that you can see Europe is a hotspot of city and municipal governments who have pledged these emission reduction targets. They comprise about 76% of the overall pledges, while there are fewer commitments from cities and regions in developing countries. So fewer than 1% we have recorded coming from sub-Saharan Africa. But then when you take a look at the population share and look at this different angle, it becomes apparent that in Europe, the proportion of the population encompassed by these climate action pledges is actually pretty small. It's only 10% of the total population under a city and regional climate action. In stark contrast, you can see in East Asia and South Asia, it's much larger and more populous cities that have pledged these types of climate actions. Despite a smaller number of cities making these recorded pledges, the ones that do in these regions are major urban centers with vast populations, thus carrying a disproportionately larger impact on the regional and global climate action efforts in these areas. And we've been measuring climate action at the subnational scale for a number of years. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold, so I apologize. Maybe you can edit out my coughs, Abby. So since we started to measure the state of global climate action in 2018, we have actually seen momentum building with a steady increase in the number of city and regional emission reduction target. The only exception is in Europe, where there were more than 6,000 target year 2020 targets that actually expired. And since COVID-19, we have seen some bounce back in the number of targets, but they have not returned to their previous numbers. And so you can see in this figure, it further breaks down the time frame by which cities and regions actually aim to implement and achieve their emission reduction goals. The majority of the targets in yellow and red indicate that cities are aiming for the medium and the long term, so between 6 and 15 or more years. And although there are some country differences, what I think is perhaps most distressing about this particular figure is that there's a relative shortage in the number of short-term targets, those where subnational governments aim to complete their efforts within 5 years after they're reported. And that could be due to some certain uncertain political cycles or external shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic, which can undermine or actually stymie some of the efforts that cities are trying to make. What's also encouraging is that cities are also setting their own net zero and decarbonization goals, which the UN's high-level expert group on net zero has specified means reducing greenhouse gases as close as possible to zero, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from natural sinks like atmosphere, ocean, and forests, and carbon neutrality targets, which are targets that are typically defined as balancing carbon emissions with removals. So we find that overall, only 1/6 of targets are net zero or carbon neutral, with more than 400 city targets that are net zero or carbon neutral, with just over 100 regional targets. And so that's really encouraging. And a lot of these net zero targets are actually coming from the global south. And so what that suggests is that as subnational governments are embarking on their own emission reduction targets, they're thinking ambitiously, and they're thinking about how to actually decarbonize and achieve net zero. But most of these net zero targets, to actually align with the IPCC 1.5 scenarios, aim for the year 2050, with only 15% that have set more ambitious timeframes. Just under half of the cities and regions with net zero targets also have an interim target, and that's a really important indicator to indicate that near-term action is actually happening and implementation is actually happening. And these are mainly coming from East Asia and the Pacific and North America. A higher percentage of subnational governments in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean have standalone net zero targets without interim targets, and that's worrying. When we take a look at their collective ambition, we can also evaluate and extrapolate to the future what they collectively aim to achieve. And so this graph illustrates that collective effort. G20 cities and regions that have committed to climate action are set to make a substantial impact. They currently represent around 20% of global emissions, but then over time, they could close almost 40% of the global emissions gap. And you can see that most of that reduction is coming from large regions. So California, which is now the fourth largest economy, or large provinces in China like Guangdong or Bavaria in Germany. So most of that reduction effort is coming from regional governments, although cities are also contributing a lot. And if we look ahead to 2050, the total estimated reduction is an impressive 8.3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. So just to give you some perspective, that's nearly equal to the current annual emissions of the US and the EU combined. And so what this tells us is that subnational governments are pledging to really ambitious action. And if they're empowered and supported, they could actually deliver real, measurable climate progress on the scale of major nations. So that's really exciting. And we're also seeing that the ambition by which cities and subnational governments are taking action is actually increasing over time. And so that's what these two plots here are showing, is that between 2017 and 2022, the time period that we've been tracking subnational governments, we can see each subsequent year has a steeper decline in projected emissions. So some of that is due to the fact that more actors are buying in and they're participating, but still overall, we're seeing that the ambition is increasing over time. The ambition and momentum is promising, but a larger question has remained elusive. Can this momentum from subnational action actually tip the scales, not just reduce emissions locally, but influence national governments to adopt stronger climate targets? And so in a recent paper, this is also under peer review, so you're getting a sneak peek at some of the latest work. We call this idea catalytic cascading. So the idea that when enough cities and regions take bold action, like setting net zero targets, it can create a ripple effect that travels upward, inspiring or pressuring national governments to actually follow. And so that's what this analysis here is showing. So you have these examples like in Australia, where virtually 8 of its states, so all of its states like New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia, had actually set net zero targets before the national government did in 2022. And so using our large scale data sets through that same Climactor data, and then also through the net zero tracker, we're able to actually track the timing of net zero pledges across countries and their subnational governments. And so when we did that within a statistical model, we can see on the right that as the share of the population becomes covered under these subnational targets, the likelihood of national adoption follows and increases. And so that's really exciting. We don't see this S-curve shape that a lot of the literature has suggested in terms of a tipping point, but there's a very clear positive relationship. And so what this means is that bottom-up momentum really matters, especially where governments are more centralized. Local action doesn't just fill gaps, it can also create political pressure, normalize ambition, and shift what's considered possible at the national level. And so that's really exciting that we have this new empirical evidence to demonstrate that linkage in a multi-level setting, that subnational action does help to influence national level policy on climate. But now I want to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges. So this presentation was about opportunities, but also challenges. So when we take a look at progress and we use the self-reported emissions data that subnational governments provide, unfortunately, we found that fewer than 40% of the cities and regions reporting inventory data have actually made enough progress to actually meet their emission reduction targets. So to meet those targets, subnational governments have to reduce annual emissions by an average of about 3%, and that's indicated by this purple dashed line in the chart. However, the data that we collected reveals that cities and regions are achieving a median reduction rate of only 1.6% per year, and that's indicated by the dashed green line. So this puts 60% of subnational governments behind the necessary pace. So that signals an urgent call for intensifying climate action to actually even achieve their own self-declared goals. And then when we take a look at what's needed for 1.5 degrees Celsius, this elusive Paris Agreement pathway, the pace is really even more off the mark. Cities are going to have to multiply their effort by 2.5 times because the reductions that are needed are in this black dashed line, 4% per year by 2030. And as it stands, fewer than 20% of climate targets by subnational governments are actually hitting this high bar. On the flip side, we also find that 1,000 actors aren't cutting emissions nearly enough, with a median annual reduction. So that's the left-hand side of this distribution. They're only reducing on average about 0.6% per year. And that includes 365 actors whose emissions have actually gone up since their baseline year. So a lot more needs to be done to actually implement those really exciting targets that they promised. And so what's actually happening? Why is it that cities are struggling with achieving their own self-declared emission reduction targets? Well, last year, my team did a meta-analysis. This was led by one of our PhD students, and we looked through the literature to actually see what is proven effective in terms of sector-based strategies or other types of cross-cutting initiatives that cities could actually focus on. And what we found is that there's a discrepancy between the strategies commonly adopted by cities in policy compared to those with the highest potential for emissions reduction. So you can see here on the Sankey diagram that the most common sectors that we found cities and subnational governments are tackling include buildings, transport, and waste. So these are all sectors that they are tackling, and agriculture for regional governments. But when we looked at the projected mitigation impact of those actions, you can see that those actions that are the most impactful include cross-cutting efforts like emission-wide reduction targets or looking at carbon pricing schemes, for example, that cover a whole set of different sectors of emissions, and also the energy system. So those achieve the largest payoff. And then those that the cities are focused on, including buildings, you can see much lower in yellow. I don't know if I have a cursor here. And then also some of the waste-related efforts and building construction, as well as alternative transport modes, even though the uncertainty in terms of their mitigation reduction is less uncertain, the actual payoff is much lower. And so there's this disconnect between what actually works in terms of delivering those deep emission cuts and what cities are focused on. And then this heat map shows also the ways in which cities have been tackling climate action. And so you can see here that cities concentrate a lot of their efforts in direct investment in transport, while regulatory and economic tools, those heavy hitters for the building and electricity and heat sectors, are actually underused. And so this pattern reflects a co-benefit bias. And so a lot of cities are trying to think about climate strategies in relation to achieving other goals like health, safety, economic growth. And they're facing a lot of constrained risks, as constrained abilities as well. So they have limited authority, financing, and often they face political risk as well that prevent them from adopting the types of policy instruments and approaches that would actually help them deliver a lot of the deeper decarbonization efforts that they strive to implement. But the good news is that we're leading up to COP30, which is happening next month. And there is a lot of attention on subnational governments and the role that cities and state level governments can play in helping to implement and further drive decarbonization action. And that's because a lot of governments, including my own, I'm American and based in the United States, have retreated from ambitious climate action, including our own net zero goal and participation in the Paris Agreement. So just yesterday, California Governor Newsom was announced as the co-chair of a local leader summit that's happening November 3rd through 5th, right before the COP30 negotiations. And this is really exciting because, as I mentioned, California is the fourth largest economy. And so they were one of the first states to adopt a net zero decarbonization pledge, ambitious vehicle emission standards, also a state level emissions trading scheme. And so they've really been leading in terms of climate action. And so if they stay the course and encourage other subnational actors to do the same, we can have hope that we will continue to not lose further ground and progress on really important climate action that's needed. And then I'll also share that I've been working quite closely with the COP30 presidency. And frankly, I've been really impressed. They are really committed to this action agenda, which includes ambitious subnational and non-state climate action, so including private actors. And so they have a whole plan for focusing on particular pillars and diving into the different sectors to come up with specific KPIs to help measure progress and to demonstrate what has been delivered. And so they're looking for folks and different initiatives that have been implemented and delivering action to highlight at the COP30. So I think there's going to be a lot of focus on these subnational and non-state actions because cities really are the engines of opportunity and innovation, and they have indicated that they're not backing down and staying the course on ambitious climate action. So thank you so much and really look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angel, for starting the forum with such an excellent talk. That was really, really fascinating. I encourage audience members to add your questions to the Q&A box. We'll get to them shortly. And I will now introduce our additional speakers and invite them to share a bit about their research backgrounds. First up, Dr. Ayub Sharifi is an urban scientist and professor at Hiroshima University, where he directs the Urban Environmental Sciences Laboratory. His research focuses on the critical intersections of urban development and environmental challenges, with a particular emphasis on sustainability frameworks, resilience planning, and comprehensive approaches to climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies in urban contexts. So, Ayub, would you share a little bit more about your research and ongoing projects?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very timely webinar. So I think you did a great job introducing me. Just to add some more content, I'm a professor at the IDEC Institute, Hiroshima University, with cross appointments at several graduate schools here, Graduate School of Innovation and Practice for Smart Society, and also Graduate School of Advanced Science and Engineering. As you mentioned, my research mainly focuses on the interface of urbanism and climate change mitigation adaptation, with particular emphasis on understanding how cities can effectively respond to climate change while promoting sustainability and resilience. So I want to thank Angel for the very insightful talk. She emphasized co-benefits in her talk, and I have a lot of focus on co-benefits because I believe, unfortunately, many policymakers, for them, it's not very tangible to discuss emission cuts, or maybe even for the public as well. But if we discuss the issues through the lens of co-benefits, it becomes more tangible, for instance, related to health and others. So for that reason, I've tried to focus a lot on co-benefits in my research. Apart from that, my work also examines other issues related to cities, including smart cities, nature-based solutions, and different aspects of urban energy. I usually try to examine critical issues related to those, and also I focus on both theoretical and applied research to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and practical implementation. I have the privilege of working with many students from developing countries, including Africa, and that's an area I would like to further explore, including informal development. So that's just a very brief introduction, and I also look forward to any questions, comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Dr. Joan Fitzgerald is a professor of urban planning and policy at Northeastern University in Boston. She examines strategies for accelerating urban climate action through neighborhood scale initiatives. And she's also the author of 2 books on linking urban climate action to economic opportunity and climate justice, and has another book forthcoming, all with Oxford University Press. Joan, can you tell us a little bit more about your research and who you work with and what your motivations are?
Sure. Yes, as we just heard, I'm a professor of urban and public policy at Northeastern University in Boston. My work focuses on urban climate action and strategies for linking it to equity, economic development, and innovation. In my 4th book, Greenovation, I argue that climate strategies of most cities represent random acts of greenness rather than integrated and aggressive action, focusing on leading cities in North America and Europe. One of the things that concerns me is that many cities have set aggressive decarbonization goals that they just won't be able to achieve. Angel's data shows this, not because goals aren't strong enough or that there's a lack of initiative or initiatives, but because cities don't control the mechanisms for decarbonization. So they do the things that they can, which aren't the most meaningful, which again, we saw in Angel's data. In 2022, I led a team in conducting an assessment of Boston's climate action for the Boston Foundation that allowed us to uncover key reasons that Boston won't be carbon neutral by 2050. We did a lot of data and interviews, data collection on the goals, but also a lot of interviews with people in state and local government. So what do I mean? Well, one thing, if you look at the EU versus the US, which is a lot of my work, cities have very different levels of power. And so being the main landowner makes a big difference in what you can accomplish. Not having that means it's more, your development is led by developers. Let's take a look at Boston again. Boston can't use the ballot box to raise dedicated funds that we see in cities like Denver and Seattle, often for funding public transit. That's set by the state legislature. Decisions on energy and power, often those are made by utility commissions, state government. Another factor, transportation agencies typically aren't controlled by the city. The other thing that we can't leave out of this discussion is politics. This is all very political. And one of the things in the current book I'm working on, we see a lot of are green cities in red states. In the United States, 23 states have both the governor and both houses of the legislature controlled by Republicans who tend not to support the climate agenda. And I'd say that's even getting worse. So if you look at Austin in Texas, Nashville in Tennessee, they may be doing very good work in terms of climate, but then you've got a legislature that's preempting a lot of the powers of cities. So I think that's a key issue that we need to talk about is the politics of it. Other aspects of my work, I just completed a project with the city of Boston on determining what kinds of jobs their climate initiative will create, which occupation, what skills, how well is the education and training system positioned to prepare residents, particularly residents from disadvantaged communities, in order to make this a just transition. So what does it take to support the green economy? In this study, we used input-output analysis of Indeed data, that is where people post jobs, to look at what kind of skills are they looking for, what constitutes a green job. And then we did a lot of interviews with providers and employers. So that's another aspect that I think that we need to make a case for urban climate action, that it's good for the economy. Another concern of mine is connecting climate action to environmental justice. Climate action has not been linked to undoing the harm that planning and policy has created in the nation's environmental justice community. And that's the book Abby mentioned that will be going to Oxford University Press this week, called Cities in the Struggle for Climate Justice, looking at cities such as Boston, Austin, Minneapolis, Oakland, and several other cities that have updated their climate action plans to be climate justice or climate equity plans. So finally, I just want to say a quick word about, we saw in Angel's data that building related emissions are large and cities do have control. But I think the problem with that is that we're going on a building by building approach. And what we really need to do is do this at the neighborhood level and in something called eco districts. I've focused a lot of this on this in my past work. It's a way to take a space, a neighborhood, and integrate all aspects of climate and sustainability. More recently, these districts have been focused around energy, geothermal networks, for example, renewable plus storage, an eco-block model that's being implemented in Oakland. And so I think if we want to get people excited about the politics of renewable or climate action, they need to see there needs to be a vision in their community that they can see their quality of life is improving. And I'm very optimistic that these energy districts are one way that cities can do that and increase their effectiveness at reaching their climate goals. Thank you.
Sorry, muted myself. Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I think the idea of quality of life improvements as a co-benefit is something we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. Moving on to our final panelists, last but certainly not least, Dr. James Evans is an Associate Dean for Research at the University of Manchester and previous Director of the Manchester Urban Institute. His research helps cities become smarter and more sustainable by using technology and data to support learning and transformation. He is passionate about reimagining the role of universities in delivering urban sustainability and has published widely in this field. He has been fortunate enough to hold visiting positions at Lund University and UCLA, and now edits the journal Frontiers in Sustainable Cities, as well as contributing to Urban 360, a university spin-out. Over to you, James.
Thank you so much, Abigail, and thank you for the invitation today. It's fantastic to be here, a real privilege, and hello from the UK. So, yeah, I guess like a lot of people, I started off studying climate change and became increasingly interested in cities for all those reasons Angel outlined so effectively. They are the places where most people live. They're the places with most of the emissions. And they're the places we really need to be focusing on if we're serious about decarbonisation. I'm going to say, I guess, 2 points, and they really relate to the question of how. How do we decarbonise? Because in some ways, we've had a lot of the solutions for a long time on the technological side. Solar panels have been around for a while. We know about building insulation. How do we do it at scale more quickly is really the big challenge to decarbonisation. And my work is focused more on the social and institutional challenges of this process. I've been interested in how cities themselves have experimented with new solutions, particularly using new methodologies like urban living labs. And it's interesting, Joan ended up talking about energy districts there and the power of trialing things in neighborhoods that people can actually see and experience. There's a famous political saying, seeing is believing. And I think when it comes to transforming cities, experiencing is believing. And we've seen that in a number of cases, even with congestion charging, congestion zones in cities like Stockholm and London. There was a lot of opposition to them. Then they were piloted. People could see the difference, experience the difference in terms of less traffic, less pollution in the air, and that generated support for them. So I guess that's the first thing I would say. Cities actually experimenting themselves is a fantastic way to develop solutions that are right for those places. And that's another thing my research has kind of shone a bit of a spotlight on. Sometimes we need local solutions. Sometimes what cities do already is actually better adapted to their own context than maybe some of the solutions we want to impose on them. Informal solutions in some urban contexts in the global south are actually better adapted, where a city has smaller roads, less good roads, smaller vehicles for taxis like rickshaws or motorbikes actually have quite a lot of advantages over four-wheel car-based solutions or buses. And similar arguments can be made around some waste solutions as well. So I think there's, again, agreeing with Angel, we need more evidence about solutions that integrate those informal and formal solutions. And the second element my work has focused on is if cities can figure out new ways to do things that work and it's successful locally, How do we then scale them up? Can we scale them up? Is something that works in one place, can it work in another place with different people, different local context? And that again has taken me towards this idea of learning. It's not about replicating, it's not about copying, it's about learning. Learning from other places, learning what works, what didn't work, learning what the people in your city want. And I think understanding the capacity of organizations to learn and then implement that learning, whether it's through organizational change or new programs of activities, is absolutely critical to scale up and accelerate this. And the final point I'll make is around lock-in and the importance of what happens now in cities. Anything that is built now is going to last for 30 or 40 years and lock in a certain way of life and a certain level of carbon use. And I always think back to an example from Peter Newman's Resilient Cities, which compared Atlanta and Barcelona, both of which have metropolitan populations of about 5 million people. Atlanta, lower density, rapidly growing North American car-dependent city. Barcelona, more historic, compact, transit-oriented, more walkable. The average inhabitant in Atlanta uses 11 times more oil, petrol, diesel per year than the average inhabitant of Barcelona. And that is driven primarily by the urban form, the way in which the city is laid out and the ways of living that enables. Every year when I teach this example, I ask my students who would rather live in Atlanta and who would rather live in Barcelona. I hope I'm not offending anyone on the call from Atlanta, but most of them say Barcelona. So there are win-wins that are possible. And I think cities are where those win-wins happen because they're where we can realize most co-benefits together. And the joy of running experiments in cities is we can generate evidence about them in terms of their social acceptability, but also the amount of carbon they save, what works and what doesn't work. And I think we're at the stage now where we have lots of solutions. We just need more evidence about exactly how they work and who they work for. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists. We're so excited to have you here today. We will now be transitioning to the more conversational part of the forum. So I encourage our panelists to return on their cameras and join us. As a reminder to the audience, you are welcome to submit questions to the Q&A box on the right of your screen, and we'll be moderating the questions for our speakers. I can see that there are already some great questions added there. I've got a question that I'll start us off with, and then we'll pivot over to the audience questions. And this one is for all of you. I'm going to ask Angel first, but the rest of you are welcome to jump in. Would you consider your work transdisciplinary, working with stakeholders, and how does that change or inform some of your research objectives?
That's a great question, Abby. I mean, I would say that it is fundamental to my work. And the work that I do, I would not be doing if I did not have the insights and the collaboration and partnership, frankly, of real world stakeholders and urban practitioners and policymakers. I mean, I didn't get into academic research because I like writing papers that nobody ever reads and that's locked behind a paywall and never has an impact. And so for me, what really excites me and what motivates my research questions and in my lab is really, what do policymakers need? And I think James said this really well. We lack this evidence about what works and for whom does it work. And Joan also said it really nicely as well in terms of equity and justice. I mean, these are questions that I think are really relevant to our everyday lives. And so for me, it's really foundational. And from the beginning, incorporating those practitioner perspectives, trying to identify the real problems, and then how can we actually solve them using data and the tools available from research and science.
Thank you. And Joan, I know that you listed several examples of transdisciplinary research that you've worked on. How did you get started with that work?
Well, I think very early on, I was frustrated by a lot of what you see, what I call the wow, look at this approach to studying sustainability, and not, as James pointed out, the how and understanding why things work and why things don't work. And so in a lot of my research, I also focus on what didn't work, and people aren't so willing to talk about that. You know, I remember interviewing the vice mayor of Malmo, Sweden once and saying, if my team's not making mistakes, then I know they're not experimenting. And if they're not experimenting, they're not learning. And I was just blown away by that comment. And with that, to understand, okay, where are you experimenting? What didn't work? And really focusing on understanding from failure as well as successes.
Thank you. Ayub, do you have anything to add here?
Yes, so I just want to echo what my colleague said. I think transdisciplinary activities are really important, and for myself, they have fundamentally affected my research, I would say, by compelling me to integrate knowledge from diverse academic fields and also non-academic stakeholders. I think when you study cities, that's somehow inevitable, because cities are basically where systems where different stakeholders must collaborate. And I think through transdisciplinary approach, I've been able to shift my focus from being narrow disciplinary, where issues couldn't be solved, to be more holistic and to have more problem-driven analysis of complex urban challenges. And when discussing with stakeholders, it's also possible to have more evidence-based decision-making, to know what the needs are, to come up with results which are more socially relevant and also applicable for policy making, and something which is not just policy prescriptive, but more policy relevant. So I would say that's very important in most fields nowadays, but especially when it comes to urban planning and cities.
Thank you. Interesting. Finally, James, do you have any thoughts to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. If you want to change something, you need to have the people who can enact the change in the room, and you need to talk to them as soon as possible and research with them. One thing I've increasingly started reflecting on, though, is who we choose to work with. Because as researchers, we do have those choices, and I fear we become somewhat path dependent. We go to municipalities, we work with planners, and we miss, and Angel, you picked this up in your graph around where the most effective places are to reduce emissions. Cities tend to do what they are able to do, which is why they often focus on direct investment in transport. If I go and talk to a city here in this country, they talk about the cost of social care. And they say, why aren't more researchers coming and helping us with that? 4/5 of our budget goes on that. We go and try and talk to them about energy. They're like, we don't control energy. Our control is so. I think it's incumbent on us to think a bit more creatively about who we work with, frame projects, urban transformation projects that are a bit more holistic, maybe.
I think that's a very interesting point. Thank you. All right, now one from the audience. This one is from Santiago, and I think it is directed at you, Angel. Regarding multi-purpose solutions, such as temperature buffering and enhancing urban biodiversity, do you believe the effectiveness of these measures, as implemented by cities, is comparable to the impact on carbon emissions shown in your meta-analysis? So again, this is, I think, touching on that question of priorities and what can cities do?
Yeah, and this is a really great question. And frankly, Santiago, I don't think we have evidence of these bundles of solutions and multi-purpose solutions and what works. And to be honest, we're struggling with that right now. So I'm a lead author of the chapter for the special report on cities and climate, focused on solutions. And we have a whole section that's all about the bundling of solutions, because we acknowledge, as James said, that a lot of cities are not coming at climate change or sustainability from that lens. They're thinking about development and social issues and economic development. And so those are obvious priorities. And I think for a lot of cities in the US right now, that's really, I think, become really obvious since the shift of the administration in the beginning of the year, where a lot of federal funding was cut off for a lot of the local implementation of climate actions that would have helped a lot of cities continue to decarbonize. And so that's where we need evidence. Frankly, if there are researchers on this call, let's work together. Let's try to figure out how we can actually quantify the multiple co-benefits and the bundling of these different solutions, not just for mitigation, but also for adaptation. I think that's also really important. And so for chapter 3, we brought together mitigation and adaptation, because it's also that cities are not tackling climate solutions in these silos either. They have to be thinking across mitigation and adaptation. And of course, there are some solutions that might be good for mitigation that could actually represent maladaptation. So I think about air conditioning as a adaptation measure to heat, but then that can also intensify the urban heat island effect. And depending on the electricity source, could also make urban emissions actually much worse. So there are these linkages between those domains and also between different sectors that have to be thought holistically. But frankly, I mean, I've been researching and surveying the literature alongside my co-authors for the last 10 months, and it's frankly really thin. And so that's one of the reasons why in that particular meta-analysis, and my PhD student did a heroic job. I mean, she started with 800,000 studies and then narrowed it down to those where there was actually a quantifiable impact that she could then assess. That's the point of the meta-analysis, and it's really challenging. So yeah, I would encourage this as a call to action. We need to be thinking about how we can actually quantify these bundles of solutions and multi-purpose solutions, because we don't know. We don't know how effective they can be compared to these other single sector or more isolated actions.
I think sort of an interesting follow-up to that question is thinking beyond co-benefits to climate and mitigation and adaptation, but to other issues that cities perhaps care a lot about, childcare, et cetera. Is there work ongoing to think even more holistically for cities across mitigation, adaptation, and beyond? Or is the literature still sort of just expanding to mitigation and adaptation co-benefits? This isn't anyone, but perhaps Joan, you might have insight here from your work with Boston.
Yeah, I think one of the things in terms of getting urban residents excited about climate action and supportive of it, as well as funding it, we have to link the climate agenda to other things that people really care about. And so we are at a point now that, when polled, climate is not one of the top things people talk about. It's affordable housing, as you mentioned, childcare, health, and there are obvious linkages. So for example, green affordable housing, we're able to build to that level now. So why aren't we? But also it's healthy housing. And so decarbonization means getting the fossil fuels out of buildings. That's better for people's health. And so that should be, forefronted in how we talk about decarbonization. We're creating healthy indoor environments as well as healthy outdoor environments. So I think those kind of co-benefits, talking about the things that they care about, is important in how we deliver on the climate agenda.
Thank you. Very interesting. Any additions from other panelists?
Yeah, I just want to add, yes, I think that there is a lot on co-benefits, and it's been booming the past 5-6 years. Majority looking into interactions between adaptation and mitigation, and not just co-benefits, also synergies. I want to emphasize synergies here, because that's very important. We can have a lot of measures which individually can have co-benefits or could have benefits for adaptation or mitigation, but we can only get the maximum benefits or maximum impact if we look at them from a synergistic viewpoint. So I would provide the example of, for instance, transit-oriented development. That's a very good example of where we can achieve co-benefits if we combine, for instance, mixed-use development with higher densities, with provision of active or public transportation. Of course, each of those individually can provide benefits, but not when they come together. And as mentioned, also there has been a lot of attention to health, I would say, and justice. And I think both of this were somehow reflected in what Joan mentioned, the part regarding affordable housing. So I would say, apart from interactions between mitigation and adaptation, there has been a lot of attention to co-benefits for health and also for justice. And I think that they are very important because for most people, those are the things that matter more than emissions, because unfortunately we tend to have short-sighted visions, unfortunately. So for most people, they want to prioritize those tangible impacts on health and justice and etc. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that brings up an interesting sort of tie-in to one of the things you talked about, Angel, which is sort of near-term implementation targets on the way to long-term goals, and sort of the connection between sort of tangible benefits now, sort of increasing ambition perhaps towards those long-term goals. And I wonder, is that something you're seeing? Is there sort of a working in of near-term implementation targets that sort of perhaps showcase some of those synergies, et cetera, in the net zero plans that are, you said there were not very many that had near-term implementation targets, but is that part of the work you're seeing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And that has given me inspiration to go back. And now we have this Climactor 2.0 data set. And so we've spatialized all of these different subnational actors that are taking climate action and making these pledges. And then we have also their climate plans. And because of AI, so this is like the one talk I've given in the last like X number of months where I haven't mentioned AI. But now we have AI tools. And so we've developed one, chatnetzero.ai, where we can then automatically search for all of the climate action plans from subnational governments. So I have a student who's doing that right now. And it would be really interesting to try to see if we see an uptick in some of this co-benefit or synergy. I think, Ayub, you're exactly right. So it's not just the co-benefits, but the synergies and also trade-offs. So that's how we're thinking about it also in the IPCC solutions chapter as well, because those are often not measured. I think Joan's point is exactly right. Like we often don't talk about the failures and the trade-offs and any potential conflictive interactions between different climate actions in different sectors and types. And so that's something that, I think we can now do with the availability of these AI tools and the fact that we can now really quickly access all of these different action plans and then actually take a look, because I think Joan is right. I mean, it's a really tough political climate. I mean, now I was just talking to a colleague who studies political polarization on the climate the other day, and he was saying, yeah, like I have to really rethink everything I'm doing on this particular topic, because if you frame anything as climate or environment or eco or sustainable, it immediately gets wrapped up in these culture and political wars, and then there's a whole half of the population that just writes off what you're doing, even if it results in things that people want, like social benefits and healthcare and cheaper groceries and all of these benefits that we all need to survive. And so it's been really interesting. And so I think at least in one of our projects, the Net Zero Tracker, we've also been developing a Net Zero back tracker to see whether or not entities are actually backsliding and changing the language in some of their net zero and decarbonization goals. And so that should be coming out fairly soon in the near term. But I think exactly measuring and this messaging piece that others were talking about, particularly Joan, I think is really, really important, because that's now become an equal part of the conversation of how to actually mobilize and implement and not to lose progress. And so in this very difficult US political climate, I think that's where we need to focus more effort. So thank you for the inspiration, because that's something that we can now analyze based on these machine learning and AI tools.
Thank you. Very interesting. Anything else to add for other panelists? All right, we're nearing the end of our session, and I think the final question I would like to ask is, cities have developed decarbonization plans, and as we move into the implementation phase, what do you see as the key factors for ensuring success, given some of these challenges we've been discussing? Looking ahead to COP30 discussions, what are you optimistic about with regards to the progress that can be made? And this question is for everyone. I think, James, we're going to start with you as the final, last to first order.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. It's a great question. I think nationally, obviously, the political winds have changed against sustainability and climate change. But I think the fact cities and regions are still pushing so hard on it is a real cause for celebration. So I think that's the reason to be optimistic. I think the key things are on the ground to show people it can address the things they do care about, the health of their children, how much things cost. And I think from a city point of view, enshrining in governance, but also leadership. It's always about leadership. Yeah, thank you.
Joan, what are you most optimistic about looking forward or seeing as success factors?
Geothermal networks. So I mentioned before the kind of eco district, but now the energy districts, focusing on energy as the first order thing before you layer on other aspects of sustainability. We have a local organization called HEAT, H-E-E-T. You might look at heet.org. And they have been very successful in working with the utilities to create these geothermal districts. So they're individual buildings having air source or ground sourced heat pumps connected by pipes that reduce the amount of energy needed for heating and cooling, something like 85%. So in terms of decarbonization goals, they're just absolutely on target. And also engage people in understanding about their energy. And where it comes from, and what a difference it makes in their day-to-day lives. And so I think politically, this is one thing that's not going to be on the radar. In fact, it might be supported. And so I'm all in on promoting this strategy.
Cool, thank you. Ayub?
Yeah, so I think to influence policymakers, the most important thing is to raise awareness of the public. And I think we're in an age with the ability to have big data analytics with all these AI developments. We have the necessary tools that can help us to crunch all this data, to come up with some evidence-based scenarios that can further raise the awareness of the people and let them know what futures they might expect. What would happen if we have no actions? What would happen if we have the right actions? And I think if we effectively raise their awareness, then eventually the policymakers would also need to listen to people, because at least in democracies, these things matter. So we have policymakers that deny climate. It's because basically most of the public maybe don't know about that, or maybe it's not their priority. But I think with evidence-based policy making, with evidence-based data analysis, we can tackle that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting. And finally, Angel, what are you optimistic about looking at COP30, where you will actually be?
Yes, yeah, I'm excited. it will be on the ground. So if you're there, please connect with me. I would love to have more in-depth conversations. I mean, I agree with all of my fellow co-panelists. And honestly, I think being in these kinds of conversations and hearing other people who are similarly optimistic and are still keeping their heads down and finding the creative solutions and the sparkles of innovation. I mean, honestly, like, I think that gives me encouragement. And I think this past weekend with 7 million people protesting and demanding for things like climate action and to topple the fossil fuel, infrastructure in the U.S., that was also really encouraging. And so what I want to share for folks who are not in the U.S. is just to know that the what's going on doesn't necessarily represent what is happening in cities. I think there's still a lot of excitement and a lot of momentum that's still happening. So I think we're ready to collaborate and to work together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been a really interesting discussion. We really appreciate your time, and we're so glad that we could be here. Great questions from the audience. A reminder that the recording will be available sometime in the next couple of days to perhaps hours, and it'll be on the CellPress Sustainability Hub. So thank you so much for watching today, and we hope to see you at the next Sustainability Forum.